Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Miriam and I am a huge quilting nerd and I'm here to share all of my random quilting knowledge with all of you. So these past couple of weeks we have been creating this really fun scrappy style quilt using quilt as you go method. And the first week we made the quilt blocks, and then last week we added our nice thin, I'm holding my little microphone here, that's what I'm doing. But we made this nice thin sashing to attach the blocks together. So now we've got a cute little baby quilt here made. It's about 37.5 inches square. So this week we get to do one of my favorite parts of quilting, and that is the quilt binding. Now, for some reason, I don't really know why, but quilt binding has kind of gotten a bad rap. I just personally do not understand it because I really enjoy adding the binding to the quilt. I like the process of making the binding, and I like adding the binding to the quilt. And, once that's done, then the quilt is done and you get to enjoy it. So I'm not sure where the bad vibes came. Where some quilters don't like binding, but I really enjoy it, and I'm going to show you my process of how I do it. I'm going to be making a scrappy version of binding, so if that's something you're interested in, stick around and we are going to make some really cute scrappy binding using fabrics that I had left over from the scraps that I was using to make these blocks. So without further ado, let's head over to cutting mat and we will get started. So like I said, I gathered up some scraps that were left over, some larger pieces from the scraps that I was using to make those quilt as you go blocks. So I figured out how much I need to cut. So to make binding, no matter what kind of binding you're making, if you're going to be making a scrappy version of binding, or if you're just going to use, you could use jelly roll strips, or you could use yardage if you're just cutting your yardage and then sewing pieces together and you want the binding to be uniform and the same fabric for the whole thing. To be able to figure out how much binding you need, there's just a little bit of math that you have to do. I know, not the math, but it's not that hard. And so what you do is you take your quilt after you have completely quilted it and trimmed it up so it's all square, then you're going to measure all four sides of your quilt. And so for my example, my quilt is 37.5 inches by 37.5 inches. So then after you measure the circumference of your quilt, then you're going to take those numbers and you're going to add them all together. So for mine, I'd take 37.5 plus 37.5 plus 37.5 plus 37.5, and that comes out to 150. So that's 150 inches long. That's how long I would need the binding if it was just one long piece of fabric that met perfectly at the end, which, I'm just not that good with my binding. So I always add 10 inches to that, the circumference total. So my total was 150. Then I add 10 to that, which gives me 160. I'm going to be cutting 20 strips that are going to measure 2.5 inches by 8.5 inches. If you want to see this in writing, these instructions for how to do this binding, I will include a link to my blog where I wrote a tutorial on how to do quilt binding, and I show you step by step how to do it. And I tried to take really good pictures, so even if you're a beginner, if you've never done your own quilt binding before, you would be able to follow along that tutorial and make your own quilt binding and attach it to your quilt. So I will include that link in the description box below. So hopefully that is helpful for someone. But let's go ahead and get started with cutting. Okay, now I have all of my strips cut out. Now I'm just going to kind of put them in an order that I would like them to go. There's no rules here. I'm just going to make sure that, you know, not all of the pinks are together and all of the blues are together, that sort of thing. So I'm just going to lay them out here. All right, there we go. I have all of my strips, and I'm going to take this and my water soluble pen. I use this all the time. If you're interested in this pen, I'm going to link it down in the description box below. This is my favorite marking pen that I found, and I've tried several, but it's the Dritz. It's like the double-ended Mark Be Gone and Disappearing Ink one, but this just works really great. Water actually dissolves this ink, and I don't have the ink ever come back, so that is very good when you're making a quilt. So I will link this in the box below, but I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine, and I'm going to show you how to sew these together to make one long binding strip. I am going to tell you right now, it's a little difficult trying to figure out the best angle to be able to show you guys how to do this stuff, because it's like I want the angle to be good for you, but I also need to be I need it to be a little good for me too, so I can see what I'm doing and make sure that I am doing it properly and showing you how to do it correctly. So anyways, hopefully this angle is going to work. We're going to try it. If it doesn't look great to me, then I will switch it around. But anyways, I just keep blabbing. All right, so I have my strips here. I got my pen, and I also have just a little ruler. I got this one off of Amazon. It's really cute. It says "sew whatever" on it. Oh my, and it's like rainbow colored and it's sparkly. I really liked it. If you're interested in it, I'll also link this down in the description box below. It was just a few dollars, and I really like it. It makes my day when I use it. So anyways, we are going to take our strips. Just pick your first two that you're going to use. And I'm going to place the first one down on my little work area here. And let me see if I can get the lighting a little bit better here. I angle this down. I think that brightened it up a little bit. Still learning, guys. I'm still learning. All right, so I have my first strip laying face up. And I'm going to take my next strip and I'm going to lay it face down. And we're going to make what looks like a backwards L. So I want them right sides together, and we're making a backwards L. Just going to line up the edge here and this bottom edge with the edge here. And then I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to lay it here, and I'm going to line it up with this corner up here and this corner down here, because we want a 45-degree angle. Make sure the fabrics are lined up. And then I'm going to take my handy dandy pen and I'm just going to mark that line, that diagonal line. And there you can see it. It's marked. It's beautiful. And that's going to be our guideline to sewing the strips together. So I'm going to move it over to my sewing machine. Make sure that those fabrics stay lined up in that backwards L position. And then I'm just going to sew my strips together. I'm going to back stitch at the beginning and the end just to make sure that these strips stay together forever. And you want to sew right along that line. You can see that there's stitches there. And then when you open it up, then it is, now we have one strip that's a little bit longer. Now the reason why we do an angle here, instead of taking the strips and lining them up just like you would when you're regular piecing, like that. When we're doing binding, that gets very bulky, that seam. I did do binding like that when I was first learning because I didn't know a better way or a more helpful way. And that does work. It just makes that seam a little bit more bulky, and I like to avoid bulky seams. So when you do it with the angle, then there's not a bunch of bulk at one seam. It's kind of diagonal on the binding and is just a lot more smooth. So we're going to do that. And I'm just going to continue sewing, doing the exact same thing. So I'm going to move this down, grab my next strip, lay them right sides together, create that backwards L shape, take my little ruler, line up the top right corner and the bottom left as I'm looking at it. Okay, and move this over underneath my needle. Okay, and I am just going to continually do that until I've got all of my strips sewn together. Now we have our nice long binding strip here. It looks super cute. Everything's sewn together. And now we have to do a couple of things. First, I'm going to come down to one of the ends here, and we have to cut off all these little extra taily poos off of this. So I am going to use my scissors, and I'm just going to cut off about 1/4 of an inch away from our stitches. So we're still leaving 1/4 of an inch seam allowance there. So I will cut off this first one. It's okay if it's a little bit bigger than 1/4 of an inch. But see, just cut off those little triangles, and then we have our seam allowance. And I'm just going to go over and do that with all of our seams, just so that cuts down a lot on, the bulk, and we do not want bulky seams, right? I really try to stray away from saying that, this is the right way to do something, because really with quilting, There are so many different ways that you can do the same exact thing. Um, and I know there are some people have had bad experiences, and whatever quilting community that they try to get into, they have people tell them like, oh, you're doing it the wrong way. And when you're a beginner, that can be really discouraging, and it a lot of times it's just not true. So I really try to stray away from saying like this is the right way to do this. Well, this is the way that I like to do it. That's what I like to say. And you know because I don't want to hinder someone from trying a new, creative outlet just because, maybe they don't do it the same exact way that I do, but that doesn't mean that their quilt is any less beautiful or any less quote unquote correct. So that's my little rampage for for this video. It really just kind of rubs me the wrong way when I hear people just kind of criticizing the way someone's doing something. It's like, hey, they're trying, they're having fun. What are they hurting? They aren't hurting anything. It's not like someone's life is going to be risked because of, they're not sewing something down the exact same way you would do it. So, anyways, I know most quilters aren't like that for sure. I haven't personally really come across anyone that's like that, but I've heard horror stories, and it's just not my cup of tea, because really quilting is it's a form of art. This is art. This isn't a rule book that you have to follow. So, anywho, okay. Now that I cut those up, let me move this ruler. Don't want to melt that with my iron. All right, now that we have those little flags cut off, now I'm going to lay my strip, my nice long strip down right side down, and I'm going to go to each one of those seams and I'm going to press it open. And the reason why I press it open is, again, to avoid those bulky seams. If you don't like pressing your seams open, you don't you don't have to do it. You can press them to one side or the other. It's totally up to you. I just like to do it open, so then the binding's just not that bulky then. Okay, now we've got all of our seams pressed open. Now I am just going to work on actually folding over the binding. This type of binding is called a double fold binding because when you're actually putting it on your quilt, there are 2 layers of fabric. They're concealing the raw edges of the quilt. So if you ever hear of double folded quilt binding, that's what this is. And this is the most commonly used quilt binding. So I am just going to be folding this in half, like so. And I'm gonna grab my iron, my iron, and then I'm just gonna take along the strip and press it in half. Now, when you're pressing your fabric, you want to make sure that you're not pulling it as you're pressing, because that's gonna cause issues when you're actually adding the binding to the quilt. It's kind of gonna give the binding a weird ripple effect, which that's not super desirable. So just try not to pull the fabric. You want it to be laying flat, but you don't want to be pulling it so it's actually stretching. So I am just going to continue pressing this. See? And then that's our binding. Pretty cool. So I'm just going to continue pressing this, and I'll speed it up, and I'll meet you at the other end of the binding strip. Okay, now I am at the end of the strip. I've almost got it completely pressed. So what I want to do is at this end, I'm going to, you can do this at either end, but this is going to be your starting end of your binding. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it and I'm going to fold that raw edge over about 1/4 of an inch like that. And then I'm going to take my iron and I'm just going to press that so that it stays down. And then I'm going to finish folding this in half with that. And that needs to stay folded because then those raw edges of this end of the strip are going to be tucked away, and that's what you want because you don't want the raw edges hanging out because then they can start fraying and stuff can start falling apart, and that's not what you want, right? There we go. We have our binding strip all done. So it's all folded in half and ready to add to our quilt. So this is what that end is going to look like. See, I've got that folded over and then the strip folded in half. So now we're going to take this over to our sewing machine and we are going to start sewing our binding onto our quilt. Okay, we are here at the sewing machine. So I've got my quilt here and I've got my binding over on this side. I'm going to set that aside for a second. So we are going to start attaching our binding to our quilt. So what you want to do is you just want to pick one of the sides, any side of the quilt. I always start mine on the right side of the quilt. But you can start it on the top edge, bottom edge, left edge, right edge. I just always start it on the right. I guess it's just the way I do it. So I always like to start, like I said, on the right side, the right edge of the quilt, and then you're going to attach the quilt binding to the quilt top first. And I always bring my binding about halfway down the right edge of the quilt. So, and it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be right in the center or anything like that. So I'm just going to line it up with my quilt. And what you want to do is you want your raw edges. So these edges, the part that's not folded of your binding, you want that lined up with the raw edge of the quilt. So I'm going to place that like that. And then I'm going to start my stitches about 2 inches away from the end of the binding. So I'm going to place my quilt underneath my needle about 2 inches away from the end. Again, it does not have to be exactly 2 inches, okay? It can be 4 or 5 inches. It doesn't matter. Just 2 inches is usually about how I do it. Place your sewing machine foot down. If you want, you can use a walking foot for this step if that makes it a little easier for you. That definitely helps if you're adding binding to a larger quilt. So if you're doing like a queen size quilt, I would recommend using a walking foot because it just kind of helps move things along smoothly. But since I'm just doing a little baby quilt, I'm just using my regular 1/4 inch seam allowance foot. So I am going to, like I said, we're going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I am just going to start sewing straight on down this edge. Don't forget to backstitch. Now, as you're moving down, you make sure that you're not pulling the binding a lot, because like when you're folding it over, you don't want to cause kind of like a weird ripple or pucker in the binding. So you want to hold it flat on the quilt, but you don't want to be actually pulling it and causing any kind of like puckering or anything. So just keep that in mind while you're going. Also, if you want, you can clip the binding in place or pin it in place if that makes it easier for you. There's all kinds of things that you can do and try and see what works best for you. Okay, now comes the fun part. We are going to be doing a mitered corner. Now, it sounds fancy. It sounds like, is that complicated? But it's not. It's actually quite simple. It took me a while to learn how to do it because some of the tutorials that I watched just seemed like they way over complicated it. And it's really not that complicated. So, what I always do is when I'm about 2 inches away from the corner, I stop and I make sure that my binding is still lined up properly, and then I stitch really slow coming up to this. So I am going to continue to stitch until I am 1/4 of an inch away from the bottom edge of the quilt. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch, and I go really slow for this part just because I do want this to kind of be exact. All right, so I am 1/4 of an inch away from the bottom edge of the quilt here with my foot. Now what I'm going to do is I want my needle to stay down in the quilt, and then I'm going to lift my presser foot up. Keep that needle down. If your machine doesn't automatically leave the needle down, then you should turn your wheel and have your needle down, because that really holds everything in place while you're moving the quilt around. So I am going to then take the quilt and I'm going to rotate it so that the point of the quilt is pointing directly at me. Oops, I just hit the microphone. It probably made a loud noise. I'm sorry. But I want that point of the quilt to be pointing directly at me. So it's like a little arrow pointing, right? And then I'm going to take the binding and I'm just going to kind of move it out of the way, but it's going to stay lined up with that raw edge there. And then I'm going to put my sewing machine foot back down, and I'm going to stitch forward to the very edge of the quilt, and I'm actually going to back stitch, forward stitch, back stitch, forward stitch a few times because I want these stitches to be really secure in this corner. Okay, and then I cut the thread. Some people don't, but this is how I like to do it. It's a little simpler. So see, I stitched all the way till I was 1/4 inch away from the, let me see if I can get it to focus a little bit better. There we go. 1/4 inch away from the edge, and then I turned it at a 45-degree angle and I stitched, and I did several passes of my stitch in that corner, and that's going to help make that really pretty mitered corner. Now we're going to rotate the quilt again so that we can work on that next edge. So I'm rotating the quilt another 45 degrees. So now the edge that I just stitched is on top, and now we are working with the next edge. So I am going to take my binding and I'm going to fold it up. I want I want to make sure that you can see this correctly. So we're going to fold the binding up like that. So we're creating a 45-degree angle with the binding right here. That needs to be 45 degrees about. So you want that binding pulled straight up, and then holding that 45-degree angle, then you pull the binding back down. Just like that. And then we line up those raw edges again here on the raw edges of the quilt. So see, there's our little 45-degree angle. And our raw edges are lined up with the next side of the quilt that we're going to stitch on. Now I'm going to move this back underneath my needle, put my foot down, and then I'm just going to stitch 1/4 inch seam allowance. Don't forget to back stitch up here because you want those stitches secure. And then we're going to just continue stitching down this side. When I get to the next corner, I'm going to change the camera angle so you can see it at a different angle, and I'll walk you through the steps again with that, okay? Okay, I've switched up the camera angle here, so hopefully you can see it a little bit better. So what we are going to do is I've stopped about 2 inches away from my corner, and I'm just going to walk you through the steps of how to do that mitered corner. So I'm going to line up my raw edges of my binding with the raw edge of the quilt, and then I'm going to stitch slowly. And I'm going to stop when I'm 1/4 inch away from that corner. Okay, now I am 1/4 inch away from our corner. I'm going to leave my needle down, and I'm going to lift my presser foot up. That needle is going to be holding our binding and our quilt together in place the way we want it. So then I'm going to rotate the quilt so that it's basically an arrow pointing straight at me, right? I'm going to move the binding over a little bit so it's out of the way. And I want that corner pointing straight at me. And then I'm going to put my presser foot back down. And now I'm going to stitch forward and back a couple of times just to secure that corner really well. So here we go. Okay, and then I cut the threads. So now you can see we've got that corner stitched down. Now, if we're looking at the quilt like that, now I'm going to rotate it again. So we're rotating it to work on this next edge, right? And I'm going to take the binding and I'm going to move it up this way. And I'm going to create a fold right here that is 45 degrees. So I want 45-degree fold right here with my binding pulled up like that. Then holding my finger on that fold, I'm going to take the binding and pull it back down towards me. And you got to leave that fold in there. And pull it down so those raw edges of the binding are lined up with the raw edges of the quilt again. And you want that fold up on top to be lined up with this top edge of the quilt. Just like that. And now I'm ready to sew again. So I put my quilt underneath my needle and I go ahead and I stitch using that 1/4 inch seam allowance, back stitch, and then I just continue to attach this all the way down. And you just repeat this process for all of the corners. So I'm going to put the camera back over where it was before, and then I'm going to continue attaching the binding to the front, and I will show you how to finish up the raw edge of the end of the binding strip. Now we are getting close to the beginning of our binding. So this is the beginning of the binding, and this is the remainder of it. So what I am going to do, I'm going to lay this on top of here, and I am going to see where I have my starting stitches. I'm going to lay this down, and I'm going to cut the excess of this extra binding off, and I'm going to cut it at an angle, which is again going to help with the bulk of that. So I'm going to cut it at kind of a steep angle, so we've got a pointy little tail, and that lines up close to with where our stitches start. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up my binding right here. So I open that up, you can see the inside like that, and then I'm going to take the end of my binding and line up the edge with the edge of the quilt and the edge of the bottom part of this binding here. So I am going to line those edges up. I'm going to move this open part of the binding out of the way, and I'm going to go continue stitching this down. And I'm going to stitch just about a 1/2 inch past that green binding, and then I'm going to back stitch 1/2 inch, and that's just going to hold that in place. So now this is secure. The green is secure, so now it won't move. And now I'm going to take this little tail and I'm going to stick this inside. I'm actually going to cut that. We don't need that. I don't need that big of a tail on there. So I'm going to cut it more like that. See? And I'm going to stick that down into that little pocket that we've created. I'm going to lay it down smooth. That's laying really smooth now. And the edges are lined up with the edge of the quilt. And now I'm going to fold the green part of the binding back over. I'm going to line the edges up with the quilt, just like that. And now I'm going to continue stitching and finish up my stitches here. Stitch. And then once I get to the stitches that I already stitched, I usually stitch about 1 inch past and then do some back stitches and forward stitches. And now that is secure. So that is the front part of the binding. It's attached now. So see where those two pieces meet. Now it's lined up perfectly, and the bulk is going to be at a minimum there at that. There's still a little bit of bulk because there's double the fabric right there. But now all those raw edges are concealed, and now we are going to flip the quilt over and attach the binding onto the back of the quilt. We've got the back of the quilt here, and we are going to get the binding and we are going to fold it over onto the back. So we're just going to do that. We're going to do that as we go here. So I'm just going to grab some of the binding and turn it over. If you want, you can throw some clips on it. I've got some of these quilting clips. This just kind of holds it in place while you're working. So you just do that and clip it. You can put a clip down every 6 inches or so is probably plenty. And that just kind of holds the binding in place as you're going along. I usually skip this step, but for the video, I'll show you how to do it. So I've got a few clips in. See? And that's just going to kind of hold the binding in place while I'm going along and sewing it down. So I'm just going to start on any one of the edges. It doesn't matter which one you start on. And I am going to be stitching. Let's see if I can move this so you can see. But I am going to be stitching as close to this edge as possible. So that folded edge of the binding. I usually try to stay about 1/8 of an inch from the edge, and that's going to create a really nice clean look on the back of the quilt. And then on the front there will be some stitches, but I'm using white thread and it's going to be totally fine if you see some thread in the front. So I'm going to go ahead and start that, and once we get to a corner I will show you what to do with those beautiful mitered corners. When you come to where your two binding pieces touched, you will notice that it's a bit more bulky there. You just want to take it nice and slow when you're going through with your sewing machine so you don't accidentally bend your sewing machine needle. So, but if you're using a sharp sewing machine needle, it should be fine. But I just always take it nice and slow, so I don't want to lose control. Okay, I'm about 2 inches away from my corner. Hopefully this is a better angle so you can see what I'm doing. So I've got our quilt here underneath the sewing machine needle, and I stopped about maybe 2 inches away from the corner. So when you come to the corner, it's going to look like that. It's going to be kind of folded over, and you got like a little pocket here. So what we're going to do is we're going to just use our finger and just push that corner into that little pocket. Like that. So it kind of looks like the corner of like a fitted sheet. And then I am going to take the binding and I'm going to fold it over and pull it kind of like that. I like to press it with my finger. And then we're going to have a 45-degree angle right here with our folded binding. Then we're just going to hold that kind of in place. And then I'm going to take the bottom binding, and I'm going to fold it over like that. We get that folded, and then right here where the two fabrics meet, that is a 45-degree angle. So I am going to continue stitching along. Let me go ahead and do that, and I am going to stop when my needle hits this folded edge. When my needle hits this fold, I'm going to stop stitching and leave the needle down. And my needle is down, holding that binding in place. So I'm going to lift my foot, and we're going to rotate. And then I'm just going to fold over this binding a little ways just so it's down, and then I'm going to push my presser foot down. And I'm going to sew up a ways so then I can show you what that corner looks like. Okay. And then if you see that corner, there's our 45-degree angle there. And see how our stitches come all the way across and then jump into that next fold and then just keep going? That's what you want. And this is what it'll look like on the front of the quilt. So that's what your mitered corner. The camera is just not wanting to focus, is it? That's what your mitered corner will look like on the front. Like a nice crisp 45-degree angle, and just looks really, really nice. So I'm going to continue stitching down the binding, and I'll show you how to do that mitered corner one more time when I get to that next corner. All right, I'm a few inches away from that corner, so here is the little pocket again. So I'm gonna push that corner out using my fingers so it looks like our fitted sheet, right? In the corner. Then I'm going to tuck those raw edges of the quilt into the binding. Get that nice crisp 45-degree angle here. Hold that in place and then flip over this binding to create that 45-degree angle right there. I'm going to stitch down if I can get it all to stay in place. That's the thing. Clips probably would be helpful here, right? Get my first stitch in this edge of the binding. Then I lift up my foot, leaving the needle down. We're going to fold that over a little bit. Put the foot down and stitch. And there's our mitered corner. It is beautiful. Our stitches go across and then down. Very nice. Our nice 45-degree angle. And then there's what it looks like on the front. A beautiful mitered corner. Now I am just going to continue stitching this down, and I will meet you back when I am all done with this. All right, I am at the very end here. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to continue stitching, and this is where we have our beginning stitches. And I am just going to stitch about an inch past that, back stitch, and then forward stitch that inch again, and then we will be done adding the binding to this quilt. there is, if I could show you, there's our binding. That's done. It looks beautiful. So here we have our close-up of our binding. It looks so cute. I love the scrappy look of the binding for this quilt. It just goes so well with the overall design. So thank you guys so much for sticking around this long for the tutorial. I really hope it helped you learn how to do a scrappy style binding for your next quilt project. And if you liked it, please go ahead and like it and subscribe if you're not subscribed. And I am planning on doing all kinds of really fun quilt tutorials coming up here this next month. So thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye.